The Italian aviation of World War II was always full of paradoxes. Aircraft that looked like works of art sometimes turned out to be vulnerable playthings of climate and time. But one of them stood out particularly, the CANT Z.1007, known as the Kingfisher. It was supposed to become the pride of the country, a symbol of elegant engineering, and at one point, it truly became the hope of the Regia Aeronautica. However, beautiful contours hid secrets that people tried not to speak aloud. The wooden fuselage cracked right in combat. Engines failed at the most intense moments, and defensive armament turned the crew into targets. Over Malta, the Kingfishers tried to push through to their targets at night, but every raid could end in disaster. On the Eastern Front, the frost tore the skin apart just as mercilessly as enemy shells. And when the country fractured, the aircraft ended up in the hands of three armies at once, each with its own, sometimes shameful, role for this machine. This is the story of an aircraft that could float after falling into the sea, but couldn't always make it to the target. Until the very end, the Kingfisher remained a symbol of Italy's ambitions and limitations. And if you watch this video until the end, you'll find out why a beautiful silhouette that inspired hope also became a symbol of the tragic contradictions of an entire era. In the mid-1930s, the Italian sky seemed entirely dominated by one company. CII Marchetti, SM, was the primary and almost sole supplier of medium bombers for the Regia Aeronautica, and its position appeared unshakable. But a monopoly never lasts forever. The feeling of change was already in the air, and a new player emerged on the horizon. CANT, or Cantieri Aeronautici e Navali Triestini. Until that moment, this firm had specialized in maritime aircraft and seaplanes, but by the end of the decade, it decided to challenge the recognized leader and assert itself in the much more complex niche of medium bomber design. The situation was such that Italy found itself in a unique position. While other countries relied on twin-engine designs, the Italians had to find workaround solutions. The reason lay not in the caprices of engineers, but in a harsh reality. The national industry could not provide engines of sufficient power. What was normal for others became a problem for Italy. Where a pair of power plants was enough, here a third engine had to be installed, just for the aircraft to even approach the required characteristics. Thus, a peculiar tradition was born. Three-engine aircraft, which looked unusual and caused surprise among foreigners, but for Italians became a forced classic. When CANT decided to embark on the path of creating its own bomber, the competition immediately became sharp. SM had no intention of yielding its position, and new designs required not only ambition, but also the courage to go against already established practice. However, the Trieste company had an ace up its sleeve, the talented engineer Filippo Zapata, ready to bring to life a project that could not just rival, but surpass the conventional aircraft of its time. It is from this moment that the story of the Kingfisher begins to gain momentum, from the first sketches on the drawing board and debates about the choice of design, to the ambitions of a government that wanted to see the new aircraft as a breakthrough and a symbol of Italian aviation's independence from foreign solutions. Everything looked as if the era itself was pushing the engineers towards a daring attempt to change the balance of power in the air. Unlike other European powers, where designers confidently managed with two powerful engines, Italy faced a different reality. The domestic industry simply could not produce engines that provided sufficient thrust for heavy aircraft. Therefore, engineers were forced to seek a compromise solution. A third engine, placed in the nose of the fuselage, was added to the standard pair. This gave rise to a unique national design that looked exotic to outsiders but became a logical way out for the Italians. This three-engine formula had both obvious advantages and hidden drawbacks. On the one hand, the extra engine gave the machine the necessary power reserve, allowing it to take off with large loads and maintain acceptable speed at cruising settings. On the other hand, the third engine meant extra weight, structural complication, increased fuel consumption, and additional operational risks. Every flight turned into a balancing act between desired performance and the limitations imposed by the design itself. But in the context of the 1930s, Italy had no choice: either continue building three-engine aircraft or acknowledge technological backwardness. This feature gave rise to a whole generation of aircraft with an unusual appearance and character, among which the future hero, the CANT Z.1007 particularly stood out. Its story began as another attempt to prove that the Italian school was capable of creating worthy competitors, even if it had to follow a path considered a dead end in other countries. It was in this environment that the approach of the engineer, who was to turn the idea into reality and transform a compromise into a symbol of ambition, was forged. Filippo Zapata, born in 1894, lived for a full century, becoming one of those Italian engineers who left a deep mark on the history of aviation. His path was not easy. He began his career during a period when the aircraft was still transforming from a fragile wooden structure into a weapon of war and an instrument of strategic superiority. By the mid-1930s, Zapata already had a reputation as a designer capable of thinking outside the box and finding solutions where others saw a dead end. He was invited to CANT precisely when the company decided to challenge the market leader. From the very beginning, he pursued two directions at once. The first project was designated Z.1007 and was classic for the Italian school of the time. 3 engines to compensate for the lack of power. The second aircraft, the Z.1007, was an attempt to build a more conventional twin-engine bomber to show that Italy could compete on par with other powers. Both projects were equipped with Isotta Fraschini Asso RC Dacis. 15 engines with a power of about 610-725 kg. On paper, the numbers looked encouraging, but practice quickly made its adjustments. The twin-engine version flew first, and the result was catastrophic. For a machine of that size, the power was clearly insufficient. The flight characteristics disappointed the military to such an extent that the subsequent fate of the Z.1011 was sealed. The 3-engine Z.1007 was perceived quite differently. It was not yet perfected, but its potential was obvious. Zapata managed to convince the command that this was the path that could give Italy a reliable medium bomber. Thus, the designer's ambition met the pragmatism of the military. The country had no time to wait for the appearance of more powerful engines, which meant the 3-engine design became not just a choice, but a necessity. For Zapata himself, it was a chance not only to secure CANT's place among military aircraft manufacturers, but also to inscribe his name in the history of Italian aviation. He understood that he would have to work at the limit of possibilities. And that's why every decision, from the fuselage structure to the cockpit layout, took on special significance. In the spring of 1936, military personnel, engineers, and company representatives gathered at the airfield to evaluate the capabilities of the new twin-engine bomber, the Z.1011. For Zapata, this was an important moment. This project was supposed to show that Italy could deviate from the 3-engine tradition and reach the level of leading aviation powers. But as soon as the machine took to the air, it became clear. The calculations were not justified. The aircraft barely managed to fly. The climb rate was agonizingly slow. Maneuverability left much to be desired. Where a burst of speed was needed, the machine seemed to get stuck in the air. The military watched the test with clear disappointment. For a heavy bomber, the engine power was too low, and there was no talk of combat value. The Z.1011 quickly acquired the stigma of a failure, and the project's fate was decided even before the test program was completed. Against this backdrop, its 3-engine counterpart, the Z.1007, looked much more promising. Despite the wooden structure and the still raw layout, it at least had enough thrust to stay confidently in the air. The Regia Aeronautica, assessing the risks, decided to place its bet on the Z.1007, not out of choice, but out of necessity. But the choice turned out to be, strategic. Thus, the failure of the Z.1011 became a turning point. Italy definitively cemented its 3-engine concept, and Zapata received the green light for further development of the Z.1007. From then on, all efforts were focused on turning this aircraft from a compromise into a functional combat machine that could compete with foreign counterparts and prove that even wood and 3 engines could give the country a weapon worthy of the war that was already looming ahead. 1937 became a time of serious changes for the Z.1007. Tests of the first variant showed that the aircraft had potential, but required radical refinement. The main problem lay in the power plant. The Isotta Fraschini Asso RC-15 engines were too weak for a machine of this size. Then the engineers decided on a replacement. The new Isotta Fraschini ASO RC-40 engines had improved high-altitude characteristics and produced 900 horsepower. This step not only allowed for an increase in speed and thrust, but also gave the structure a reserve for future modifications. However, the work was not only under the cowling. Zapata meticulously revised the airframe itself. The fuselage became more streamlined, which reduced drag. The structural elements were reinforced to cope with additional loads, and the empennage was redesigned, which had previously caused pilot complaints about longitudinal instability. Small but important changes were added to the design, from the wing shape to the location of hatches and the crew cabin. All of this was done with an eye on the future, as this machine was to become the basis for the deep modification that would later receive the Index Biz. The spring 1937 tests showed that the updated Z.1007 had become noticeably more lively and responsive. The military no longer viewed it as a compromise, but saw it as a real candidate for serial production. The machine was acquiring features that allowed it to be considered promising, and it was then that the idea began to form in the designers' minds to not just improve the aircraft, but to virtually rebuild it, with different engines, a reinforced airframe, and expanded capabilities. Thus, the foundation was laid for the future Z.1007 BS, which became the true face of the project. By the end of 1937, it became clear that simply replacing the engines was not enough. The aircraft required much deeper modernization. It was then that Zapata and his team decided on a new step, a complete structural overhaul that was supposed to take the project to another level. This is how the Z.1007 BS was born, a machine that outwardly resembled its predecessor, but was essentially an almost new aircraft. The main change was the power plant. Instead of the inline ASO engines, the engineers chose 3 Piaggio PXE RC-40 radial engines, each with a power of about 1,000 horsepower. These engines promised better reliability, stable high-altitude operation, and a greater power reserve. But to accommodate the new engines, the fuselage cross-section had to be increased and the structural nodes reinforced. The structure became more massive, but at the same time, the aerodynamics acquired new contours. The lines became cleaner, the body shape more elegant and streamlined. Special attention was paid to the defense. While the earlier machines looked vulnerable, the Bs received new firing points. A turret capable of circular fire was installed on the spine. A mount for rear hemisphere defense was placed on the belly, and the tail unit was reinforced to compensate for the new loads. All of this made the aircraft more survivable and gave the crew at least some chance in a fight against modern fighters. The government, impressed by the calculations and mock-ups, signed a contract for serial production even before the prototype first took to the air. This confidence was explained by 2 factors: cleaner lines compared to the Savoia Marchetti S-79 and a powerful power plant that promised to take the machine to a new level. When the Z.1007 BS finally took off in 1938, it became clear that the bet had paid off. The aircraft looked modern, fast, and flexible enough to become the backbone of the Italian bomber fleet in the looming war. From the moment of the first successful flight of the Z.1007 BS, the project instantly moved from the experimental category to the strategically important one. The authorities understood there was no more time for delays. Europe was rapidly heading toward a great war, and the Regia Aeronautica needed new machines. Therefore, the decision for serial production was made swiftly, and production began in 1939. The main burden fell on the CRDA shipyards in Monfalcone, where CANT's production was previously based. Most of the aircraft were built there, almost 500 machines. An additional order was received by Industrie Meccaniche e Aeronautiche Meridionali, IMAM, which was tasked with manufacturing the remaining portion of the batch. They had much less experience with such projects, but the political objective required connecting all the country's resources. As a result, by August 1943, when Italy was already on the verge of armistice, 580 aircraft had been built, 486 at CRDA and 94 at IMAM. On paper, the number looked solid, but the reality was much more complex. Her production was intermittent. There was a lack of materials. The specifics of the wooden construction, which required time and skilled labor, had an effect. The pace did not always meet the military's demands, and the machines arrived at the front in batches, sometimes too small to influence the outcome of operations. Nevertheless, in a short time, Italy managed to create and mass-produce a new type of bomber that became the mainstay of its aviation during the most intense years. Each machine produced was not just a product of the assembly line, but the result of the intense labor of dozens of engineers and workers who, in conditions of resource scarcity and time pressure, strived to deliver a result upon which the country's reputation in the air depended. One of the most unusual features of the Z.1007 bis was its fuselage, narrow, elongated, as if compressed for speed. The designers aimed for minimal drag and, for this, made a bold decision. Instead of the usual side-by-side pilot seating, they seated them one behind the other in a so-called tandem layout. For medium bombers of that time, this looked atypical and raised questions, but this very solution allowed for the slender body to be maintained and cleaner aerodynamics to be achieved. The front panel in the cockpit belonged to the main pilot. This is where the flight and navigation instruments were located. Behind his back was the second pilot, who had his own set of instruments, mainly for monitoring engine operation and duplicating functions. His role was rarely reduced to full aircraft control, but in case of commander fatigue, he could take the yoke and guide the machine to the correct course, or even land it. More often, he helped relieve the main pilot, monitored instruments, duplicated commands, and served as an extra pair of eyes in tense situations. The crew generally numbered 5, sometimes 6 people. In addition to the 2 pilots, the team included a bombardier navigator who literally squeezed into his seat through a hatch under the instrument panel, diving into a cramped compartment right behind the central engine. This arrangement looked inconvenient, but allowed for compactness and rational use of space. Next came the radio operator gunner, who combined communication with control and protection from the air, and the side gunner flight engineer, who was responsible for both the machine guns and the technical condition of the components during the flight. This entire setup made working aboard the Z.1007 bis very cramped and demanding of coordination. Every step was calculated. Every crew member knew that his area of responsibility was small in size but critically important. The machine might seem uncomfortable, but it was designed so that in combat, every element worked toward the overall goal, delivering bombs to the target and returning alive. Despite its external elegance and clean lines, the Z.1007 bis had weak points that repeatedly manifested in combat sorties. The main vulnerability was the defensive armament. On paper, the set of firing points looked respectable. 2 turrets with large caliber 12.7mm machine guns, 1 top, 1 bottom, and a pair of side mounts with 7.7mm guns. But in practice, this was often insufficient. The rotating turrets had limited sectors of fire, and the side machine guns covered only narrow angles. Consequently, during attacks from a high-speed dive or from the rear hemisphere, the crew felt vulnerable, especially compared to Allied counterparts, where defensive mounts covered more directions. Longitudinal stability caused no less trouble. The first serial machines with a single tail fin suffered from the aircraft yawing in flight and required constant course correction from the pilots. On long-distance transfers, this fatigued the crew and reduced navigation accuracy. Testers repeatedly noted that the machine needed an empennage redesign. The solution came in the form of a transition to a twin vertical stabilizer, implemented in later series. The twin tail surfaces allowed for better flow stabilization, and control became more predictable. This did not turn the Z.1007 bis into a benchmark of stability, but it noticeably made life easier for the pilots and made the machine more reliable on combat courses. Thus, the Italian bomber turned out to be a typical product of its school. Fast, graceful, with good aerodynamics, but with a defense that left the crew in the danger zone. Even the improvement of the empennage only partially compensated for these shortcomings. In conditions where the opponent became modern Allied fighters, every flaw in defense or stability incurred too high a price. When the first Z.1007 bis squadrons found themselves in combat conditions, an unexpected enemy emerged that the engineers could not overcome with blueprints or calculations. This enemy was climate. The wooden structure, which in Italy looked like a practical and light solution, turned into a real problem in Africa, the Balkans, and especially the USSR. Under the scorching sun of North Africa, the glue holding the airframe elements together lost strength. The skin began to crack, and the structural elements gradually deformed. The humidity of the Balkans worked differently, but was no less destructive. The wood swelled, and delaminations appeared on the surface, sharply increasing drag. Where the aircraft was capable of good speed yesterday, today it struggled, as if resisting the air. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even harsher. Frosts and temperature changes caused the materials to become brittle, and new cracks and gaps appeared. Pilots and technicians often complained that the machines required constant repair, and sometimes did not withstand long campaign conditions at all. And yet, the wooden structure had one unexpected advantage. In the event of an emergency water landing, which was not always avoided in the Mediterranean, the aircraft could stay afloat for some time. This gave the crew a chance to escape, wait for help, or reach the shore. Where an all-metal machine would sink almost immediately, the Kingfisher floated, as if confirming its name. Thus, wood became both the strength and the weakness of the Italian bomber. It facilitated production and allowed for mass reduction. But in combat conditions, it became a weak point, especially in regions where nature itself became the tester. In combat aviation, numbers often speak louder than any words. For the Z.1007 bis, they became the main argument when compared to competitors. The maximum speed of the machine reached approximately 455-460 km/h at an altitude of about 4,000-6,000 min. This was decent until the end of the 1930s, but by the middle of the war, it looked like an average result. Many new Allied fighters easily pulled ahead. The flight range also had a dual nature. Without a load, the bomber could fly up to 2,500 kilometers, but with a full combat load of 200 kilos of bombs, the actual range was reduced by almost half. This limited the possibilities for deep raids and forced maximum caution in route planning. The service ceiling was about 8,000 alarm, a level that offered a chance to escape anti-aircraft fire, but did not make the aircraft unreachable. At high altitudes, the engines began to lose efficiency, and pilots more often chose medium echelons, where the risk of encountering enemy fighters was especially high. The combat load was a strength and a compromise at the same time. The Kingfisher could carry up to 1,100 kilos of bombs or 2 heavy torpedoes, a figure that made it versatile for various tasks, from striking airfields and columns to attacking ships in the Mediterranean. But compared to the 4-engine giants of the Allies, this looked modest, and the Italians had to rely on tactical flexibility rather than the massive explosives. In early 1943, the final variant of the Z.1007 appeared. It was equipped with more powerful Piaggio-pieced naval engines, which increased the ceiling to almost $10,000 and raised the maximum speed to 490 km/h. However, this success was too late. Only a little over 3 dozen such machines were built, and they could no longer affect the overall course of the war. Italian industry at that moment was working at its limit, and the country was rapidly losing control of its skies. Thus, the numbers of the Z.1007 reflected the nature of a compromise. It was faster and more maneuverable than many of its Italian counterparts, but inferior to the best Allied models. It could carry torpedoes and a bomb load, but only within a limited radius. Its latest version looked promising, but appeared too late to change the fate of the machine and the war in which it was born. In the spring of 1940, the Z.1007s first had a chance to prove themselves in combat. They were sent to where the stakes were especially high, to besieged Malta. This tiny island in the center of the Mediterranean controlled the sea lanes, and the Allies had turned it into a powerful fortress. For the Italians, it was a thorn in their side. Without suppressing Malta, it was impossible to safely move the fleet and supplies. Initially, only small groups of Kingfishers flew on missions. At night, they disappeared into the darkness to bomb ports and airfields. In those months, the tactics seemed justified. In the darkness, the enemy had fewer chances to intercept the bombers. But it soon became clear that only half of the 3 dozen machines sent remained operational. Some were lost in accidents or shot down. Others were idle without repair. The situation deteriorated sharply in 1942, when the latest Spitfire Mako V fighters arrived in Malta. Every encounter with them resulted in heavy losses. The Z.1007 lacked the speed to escape and the defensive fire to fight back. Crews had to change tactics, resorting to night raids, flying at low altitudes, and using clouds as cover. But even this did not always save them. The Spitfires were too fast and agile. For the Italian bomber units, Malta became a school of survival. It showed the limits of the Kingfisher's capabilities and forced a change in the approach to its use. After the campaign, the command increasingly directed these machines to other theaters where the threat from Allied aviation was weaker, and the machine itself could realize its potential, whether it was reconnaissance, striking communication lines, or raiding targets in the eastern Mediterranean. Thus, Malta became not only a baptism of fire, but also the first serious lesson. The aircraft entrusted with the fate of the operation proved vulnerable in conditions of enemy air superiority. After the heavy sorties over Malta, the Kingfishers were also tried in other operations that required long-distance flights and a demonstration of the Regia Aeronautica's capabilities outside the usual Mediterranean. One of the most unusual episodes was the Battle of Britain. Italy decided to support Germany with a symbolic presence and sent several of its units to Belgium. Among them were 3 CANT Z.1007s. Formally, they were listed as part of a strategic reconnaissance squadron, but there was no real need for their work. The German Luftwaffe already controlled the airspace with much more advanced machines. Therefore, the Italian crews were assigned secondary tasks of monitoring areas where no surprises were expected. These flights demonstrated Allied solidarity rather than providing utility. But the fact remains. 3 wooden Kingfishers ended up over northern Europe in the midst of the most fierce confrontation. Raids on the Middle East looked much more ambitious. In the autumn of 1940, the Italian command decided to strike British oil facilities in the Haifa region. A Z.1007 squadron based in Greece was allocated for the task. But the journey to the target was a test in itself. The route passed over Yugoslavia, the Balkan mountains, and then through Lebanon, a French Mandate territory, where opposition could be expected at any moment. These raids became a symbol of the long reach of Italian aviation. The aircraft overcame hundreds of kilometers over hostile territories, risking being spotted or intercepted, and only a few reached the target area. Crew fatigue, limited combat load, and the high probability of losses made such missions more of a political gesture than a military necessity. But for the pilots themselves, they became a test of the limits of their machines and their own strength. It was in these operations that the essence of the Z.1007 was finally revealed. It could reach far, it could carry a torpedo or bomb load across half a continent, but every such flight required extreme tension and was paid for with a high price. In the spring of 1941, the Kingfishers found themselves in the Balkans. The campaign against Yugoslavia lasted only 12 days, and here, the Z.1007s were used to bomb transport hubs and military positions. In conditions of weak anti-aircraft defense, they acted confidently. And it was in these short weeks that the machine showed what it could be under favorable circumstances: fast, maneuverable, capable of quickly striking and escaping. But this was more the exception than the rule. After the Balkans, the Z.1007s returned to their main mission: control over sea communications in the Mediterranean. They patrolled Allied supply routes, attacked ships and ports, and served as torpedo bombers. Sometimes these actions brought success, but more often they were accompanied by high losses. In conditions of dense counteraction from the British Air Force and Navy, the Kingfisher's vulnerability was fully manifested again. Insufficient defense and average speed made every operation a dangerous trial. In Africa, the bombers served for a limited time. The harsh climate quickly rendered the wooden structure inoperable. The hot sun and sand destroyed the skin. The equipment required constant repair, and combat readiness decreased with every sortie. Even despite combat successes, operation in desert conditions became a real torture for the machines and crews. Their participation on the Eastern Front was even shorter. The Z.1007s sent to the Soviet vastness soon showed their complete unsuitability for the local frosts. The wood cracked, glue joints separated, and systems failed. Pilots and technicians did everything possible to maintain combat readiness, but the harsh climate literally consumed the aircraft. As a result, the Kingfishers were quickly withdrawn from operation in this direction. Each theater of war became a kind of examination for the Italian bomber. Where the enemy was weak and the climate was mild, the machine demonstrated its strengths. But as soon as the conditions became harsher, the compromises of the design emerged, and the aircraft showed that it was not created for all trials. September 1943 became a turning point not only for Italy, but also for the fate of its aviation. After the signing of the armistice with the Allies, the country virtually split, and everything that remained on the airfields fell into the hands of new masters. In the north, the Germans quickly occupied the warehouses and bases where about 3 dozen Z.1007s survived, but they were not in a hurry to use them as intended. Wooden bombers with limited capabilities and problematic engines were of no value to the Luftwaffe, which had its own, much more advanced machines. Most of the captured Kingfishers were either dismantled for spare parts or left idle at secondary airfields. A completely different fate awaited the aircraft that ended up in the hands of the new structure, the Italian co-belligerent Air Force. These units, which sided with the Allies, continued to use the remaining bombers in limited operations. They were used for patrolling and supporting Allied actions in the Mediterranean, but their role was mostly auxiliary. By that time, the aircraft was already considered obsolete, and its value lay more in filling gaps until modern equipment arrived. An unusual page opened in Croatia, where the Germans transferred 6 Z.1007s in the summer of 1944. They were intended for fighting partisans, but the Croatian command quickly realized that the machines were too unreliable for these tasks. Instead of the front, they were left in training units, where they served to prepare pilots. Even here, exploitation went to the limit until there were enough spare parts and the wooden structures did not completely break down. By early 1945, all 6 machines had to be written off. Thus, by the end of the war, the fate of the Kingfisher had split into fragments. Somewhere it stood forgotten on captured airfields, somewhere it served in auxiliary missions, and somewhere it became a training aid for young pilots. The symbol of the once bold project had by that time turned into a machine that was merely living out its last days. The story of the Z.1007 concludes not on the battlefield, or in reports of military victories, but in reflections on what it left behind. The Kingfisher became a vivid example of Italian engineering thought. The pursuit of beauty of form was combined with the search for original solutions. Its contours were clean, the aerodynamics were graceful, the cockpit and internal components bold for their time. The machine looked elegant and even refined against the backdrop of many angular and crude bombers from other countries. But behind this beauty lay systemic limitations. Italy never managed to establish the production of truly powerful and reliable engines, and wood as the primary material became the weak link in any harsh environment. As a result, the aircraft, which had potential and an interesting design, constantly faced compromises. It lacked a bit of range, it lacked a bit of speed, it broke down a little more often than the military would have liked. The Z.1007 lived its life as a symbol of the paradoxes of Italian aviation. It could be a formidable weapon against a weak opponent, but lost its advantage as soon as it encountered modern fighters or a harsh climate. It was produced by the hundreds, but never became truly mass-produced like British or American bombers. And yet, it left a legacy. It showed that Italy was capable of creating original and competitive projects, even if they lacked the resources to bring them to perfection. It reminded us that in the history of aviation, not only victory is valued, but also the journey, a path of engineering search, bold decisions, and struggle against limitations. The Kingfisher remained not as a machine that changed the course of the war, but as a reflection of an entire era, where in every takeoff there was a hope that a beautiful silhouette and a daring concept could surpass a harsh reality.